Hey everyone, I've had a lot of people asking me about sound cards lately, and so I wanted to do a video all dedicated to what you should look for in a sound card, or an audio MIDI interface, as a lot of people call them. The first big thing to understand is what you're going to be using it for. Because if you're doing a lot of recording, say you're multi-tracking a band, you need a very different type of sound card than if you're just taking Ableton out and you want to DJ and perform in a club. So I'm going to walk you through two different types of sound cards, both of which are ones that I own and use extensively. And I'll just walk you through the basics of the features and specifically what you should look for in them. The first thing we'll talk about are bit depths and sample rates. So bit depth is the number of stages or layers that are available to approximate a waveform. And right now I'm producing all of my music in 24-bit and exporting to 24-bit. So I would recommend that you have a sound card that's at least capable of 24-bit. Most modern sound cards are absolutely capable of both recording and playback in 24-bit if they're a professional grade sound card. In fact, most of them are operating at 32-bit. 32-bit is overkill, in my opinion, for most of what you need to do, but do make sure that your sound card is at least capable of 24-bit. Sample rates is a completely different story. The sample rate is the number of times per second in kilohertz that the sound card will take a snapshot of the audio waveform. So the higher the sample rate, the smoother and the more accurate your audio waveform will be. However, there gets to be a point where the human ear no longer can perceive differences in things that are that accurate. So CD quality is 44.1 kilohertz, and most music is exported and produced in 44.1 kilohertz. There are very rare instances where you might want a sample rate that's higher than 44.1. For example, a lot of sound cards these days are capable of 96 kilohertz, and in some cases you may want to use that if you're experiencing aliasing up top. But even beyond that now, most sound cards are capable of 192 kilohertz. And that's something to watch out for because that's basically just a marketing gimmick. There is virtually no perceptible difference in the opinions of the mix and mastering and recording engineers I've spoken with anyways, difference between that super high sample rate and the lower sample rates. So it's mainly just been as a result of marketing new cards. You know, if they say it's a 192 kilohertz sample rate card, more people buy that versus a 96 kilohertz card. So it doesn't really offer any appreciable difference. So that's bit depths and sample rates. The next thing you need to understand is if you need to have a traditional MIDI in and out from the audio interface. A lot of the older audio interfaces are also MIDI interfaces, and you can plug things like this traditional MIDI cable into it. Most modern MIDI controllers are all done over USB, so you don't need to have one of the MIDI control cables. But if you do have devices in your studio like I do that use MIDI, then you're going to want a card that has MIDI integrated into it. It usually means the card's a bit bigger. This is the card that I gig with, and this is a MOTU Microbook sound card. And it, as you can see, has only a limited number of inputs and outputs, and it doesn't have any MIDI. In the studio, and if I need to take one of my MIDI devices on the road with me on tour, I use this card, which is a little bit beefier. This is a MOTU Microbook, or a MOTU Ultralite Mark III. And as you can see on the back of this card, it's got two of the traditional MIDI connectors, one for input and one for output. So that's an important thing to understand if you need traditional MIDI or if you want to go for something a little bit more streamlined. The next thing we'll talk about are inputs and outputs. And depending on what you're doing with the card, you need obviously a different number of inputs and outputs. Like I showed you before, this Microbook card I just use for DJing with live, basically. So it's got a left and a right main out that are 1/4 inch, and it's got a stereo line out if I need to output to a smaller jack. And it's got 4 inputs. It's got guitar line in on the front that can phantom power, and it's got 2 line ins on the back. So I can simultaneously run 2 stereo pairs into this card. Now, another thing you might want to consider is if you need phantom power on your inputs. And phantom power is if you're running a microphone like this one, it's a condenser mic, that requires a power source, 48 volt phantom power, then you need to have a card that can phantom power the microphone to have it work properly. Now, all of my cards do have the ability to phantom power. So that's something that I look for because I do a fair bit of recording and I want to have that flexibility on any of my cards, even the small ones. So when you're choosing a card, You also have different types of inputs and outputs. This card only has 1/4 inch inputs and outputs. It doesn't have XLR. And that's actually fine by me because most mixers that I plug into use 1/4 inch. But there's also a couple types of XLRs. There's balanced and there's unbalanced. I always get cards that have balanced inputs and outputs because I find those shield against extra noise. If I don't have balanced, like my first sound card I ever bought was this Tascam piece of crap, and it didn't have balanced outputs. And whenever my cell phone was around it or a cordless phone or something like that, it would hum and buzz and pop and crack in the noise and in the lines, and that's just not something that I wanted in my studio. So that's one thing I like about this little card is it's got balanced inputs and outputs. So does my larger MOTU card. But one difference that this Ultralite has that the Microbook doesn't is it's got XLR inputs. It's got these Neutrik connections on the front. And what these mean is I can plug an XLR cable into it, like the one I would use for this microphone. See, it has an XLR connection on the back. Or in the center, it's got a connection for 1/4 inch. Same thing on the back. There's an input on the back, so I can have 2 XLR inputs coming in, and both of these can be phantom powered. On the front of the card, it's got phantom power 48-volt switches I can turn on or off. And this one is a banging little card. I've used it for the last couple of years, and I absolutely love it. The next thing we'll talk about are analog digital and digital analog converters. So when you have an audio source that you're recording, that's in the analog realm. It's acoustic analog audio. And it needs to be converted into digital audio that's a computer representation of that audio waveform based on the bit depth and sample rate. And the device that does that conversion is called an analog digital converter, or AD converter. Now, not all analog digital converters are created equally, and a lot of the ones that are on these cards, my cards are decent, but they're not super, super high end. So if I was going to do really, really high-end recording, I would go to a studio because the analog digital converters on these cards are just not up to the task of a super, super high-grade recording. Does this mean you can't record on cards that are under $2,000 or $3,000? No, absolutely you can. It just means that keep that in mind, that when you go to a higher-end sound card, the quality of the analog digital converter is going to be better. Now, on the other way out, when the card's producing sound, it's going from digital back to analog, so it can be sent out to your speakers. So that is a digital to analog converter, or a DA converter, which is the opposite. It takes a digital waveform and it converts it out into an analog signal. Now, that's also an important part of a sound card, and the quality of the digital to analog converters will also influence the quality of the sound that comes out on the speakers. So MOTU cards, the ones that I'm using, I've always been really happy with the DA converters on them. I know if you want to go even a bit more high-end, some of the Apogee cards are really good, but for the purposes that I've used, I've plugged my sound cards into lots of big sound systems, and it sounded just fine using the digital to analog converters that I have on board. The last thing we'll talk about with our sound cards video today is onboard DSP power. And some sound cards, actually, because they are effectively little computers, have an onboard signal processing function. Specifically, this MOTU card, you'll see it has an LCD display. This card can actually substitute as a standalone digital mixer. So it doesn't even need to be connected to my computer. This actually has compressors and EQs and reverbs all built right into it. And you can access that from a MOTU application that runs on my computer, or by navigating through the LCD display on the sound card. You may or may not want that. I find it useful sometimes. If I was ever going to put a little bit of compression on, say, my sax that I play into the sound card, that would be helpful, or I could always do that in Ableton. But keep that in mind. It does make the sound card a little bit more versatile, and sometimes if you're using the DSP processing on your sound card, it can take a little bit of the heat off the processor on your computer because it's running all of those effects on the internal processors within the sound card. So some sound cards come with them, some sound cards don't. I find a lot of them these days do come with onboard DSP. And if you want those, just check those out and make sure it's got the features that you want. So that wraps up our video on sound cards. I hope you guys found that useful. Choosing a sound card is essential. Trusting the internal built-in sound cards in your computer is not good. You want to make sure that you're using a pro-grade sound card if you're serious about making music, and especially if you're performing out live. So as you're navigating that, definitely refer back to these tips, and hope that helps you guys to choose a great sound card for your studio. Talk to you soon.